Stone by stone, they rose, not just as homes for kings, but as fortresses of fear, control, and survival. Behind every towering wall and winding stair lies a secret whispered across centuries. These castles weren't just built, they were engineered to deceive, intimidate, and endure. From hidden murder holes to architectural lies designed to confuse invaders, medieval builders left behind more than just ruins. They embedded messages in mortar. What if the castles you thought you knew were hiding truths far more cunning? Welcome to the secrets they never taught in history class. In the medieval world, perception was power. As kingdoms rose and feudal lords asserted their dominance, castles became more than military fortresses. They were monumental symbols of authority. One of the subtlest yet most widespread techniques employed in their construction was the manipulation of height. Through architectural illusion, contrary to popular belief, many castles weren't as tall as they seemed. Yet to the eye of an approaching traveler or potential enemy, they appeared to loom impossibly high, casting a shadow not just over the landscape, but over minds. This effect was not accidental. Castle builders, particularly from the 11th to 14th centuries, deliberately used terrain, proportion, and perspective to exaggerate vertical scale. Take the Château de Chambord in France. Though built later in the Renaissance, its design drew from medieval traditions. With narrow towers and steep, pointed roofs, its silhouette reaches skyward, enhancing the illusion of grandeur. In earlier medieval structures, especially in Norman and Romanesque styles, builders placed keeps on raised mottes, artificial hills, making the central towers seem to rise above the horizon even when it measured only a few stories. At Caerphilly Castle in Wales, constructed in the 13th century under Gilbert de Clare, the massive gatehouses were designed with twin towers flanking the entrance. Viewed from ground level, the eye was drawn upward along vertical lines, arrow slits, crenellations, and buttresses, all structured to emphasize height. Yet the actual interiors of these towers were often more modest than their exteriors. Suggested another technique lay in the narrowing of the upper levels. By gradually reducing the diameter or width of a tower as it rose, architects exploited forced perspective, a principle well understood long before the Renaissance artists formalized it. This made the structure seem taller when viewed from below, particularly from the angle of an approaching force or emissary in many cases. The emphasis on perceived height was not strictly for defense. Castles such as Bodiam in Sussex were as much about display as fortification. Built in the late 14th century by Sir Edward Daylingrig, Bodiam features symmetrical towers reflected in an artificial moat, a theatrical presentation of power and refinement. Historians argue that such structures were carefully choreographed performances of dominance, crafted for allies and adversaries alike. The illusion of height, then, served to masters military strategy and political spectacle. It created a visual language of strength, one that spoke across valleys, over rivers, and into the hearts of those who dared challenge it. Above the main entrances of many medieval castles, hidden within the stonework, lay one of the most feared and misunderstood features of fortification architecture, the murder hole. These small, deliberate openings were carved into the ceilings of gate passages or narrow corridors. From them, defenders could attack intruders from above with deadly efficiency, often without ever being seen. But their purpose extended beyond brute force. Murder holes were tools of calculated intimidation, designed as much to break morale as to inflict harm. Contrary to popular imagery, Boiling oil was rarely used. It was far too costly and impractical. Instead, defenders poured more accessible materials: scalding water, heated sand, quicklime, and even rocks or arrows. In close sieges, even human waste was used to spread disease and sow chaos. Positioned above the most vulnerable choke points, especially gateways and narrow inner passages, murder holes gave defenders a lethal advantage. As attackers forced their way through the first set of doors, they were often funneled into a tight corridor beneath these openings, unaware that defenders waited directly above. Design played a critical role in their effectiveness. In castles, like Château de Préfens in France or England's Bodiam Castle, murder holes were often built into vaulted ceilings or concealed behind decorative stonework. Their angles and placements were carefully calculated. Some opened into multiple entry points, allowing defenders to attack from different positions. Others were paired with reinforced trapdoors, enabling defenders to drop projectiles in a precise sequence. The goal wasn't only to kill, it was to sow panic, confusion, and hesitation during an already chaotic breach. The psychological effect was significant. For attacking forces, every step into a gatehouse became a gamble. Defenders could remain hidden, striking from above with no risk of immediate retaliation. A single failed push under these conditions could mean a complete withdrawal or a crushing loss of morale. The message was clear. The castle itself was watching, and it had teeth in the ceiling. By the late 13th and 14th centuries, as siege warfare grew more sophisticated, murder holes evolved alongside other passive defenses. They were often integrated with portcullises and drawbridges, creating multiple layers of resistance. Some were added to postern gates, smaller, hidden entries used in emergencies to protect against infiltration. In heavily fortified castles like Crac des Chevaliers, in modern-day Syria, murder holes were part of a broader system that included angled walls, inner courtyards, and reinforced towers. Though their name evokes brutality, murder holes were less about indiscriminate slaughter and more about controlled, strategic defense. They served as a reminder that castle architecture wasn't static stone. It was an active battlefield, shaped by the minds of engineers who understood that fear was just as effective as steel. In medieval castles, architecture was never arbitrary. Even the direction of a staircase could mean the difference between survival and defeat. Across Europe, from the Norman keeps of England to the stone towers of France and Germany, spiral staircases almost universally turned clockwise as they ascended. This was not a matter of style, it was tactical design. The layout favored defenders, moving downward. A right-handed swordsman descending the stairs would have room to swing freely. For an attacker ascending, the same spiral severely restricted movement, with the inner wall on the right constraining the sword arm and forcing the shield hand to the exposed outside. This advantage was particularly relevant during close quarters fighting, in sieges where attackers breached the outer walls and stormed the keep. Stairwells became deadly bottlenecks. With the staircase narrowing as it rose, the confined space amplified the defender's positional edge. A single, well-placed defender could hold off multiple attackers by exploiting both elevation and maneuverability. The curve of the staircase also limited the line of sight, forcing invaders to fight blind around the bend, never sure who or what awaited at the next step. The clockwise spiral design became standard by the 12th century, especially in Norman and Plantagenet castles. Yet this rule was not without exceptions. The 13th century Scottish castle of Bothwell, constructed under the direction of Walter of Moray, featured a rare counterclockwise spiral in one of its towers. While some historians suggest this was simply a structural variation, others believe it was intentional, possibly commissioned by a left-handed noble who sought to invert the usual advantage. Another example appears at Craigmillar Castle, near Edinburgh, where one stair tower spirals counterclockwise, though the majority do not. These anomalies remain rare and often debated, but they raise important questions about individual customization and the influence of dominant-handedness. On military architecture, beyond hand preference, some reverse spirals may have been designed for symbolic or ceremonial purposes. In certain ecclesiastical buildings, staircases reversed to separate monastic movement or to reflect theological concepts. But in castles, where every stone was a matter of defense, form followed function. The staircases also served a strategic, defensive role beyond swordplay. They were often deliberately narrow, sometimes just wide enough for a single man. This prevented enemies from attacking in force and allowed defenders to slow advances without exposing themselves to multiple blades. Some were constructed with uneven steps to trip the unfamiliar foot, and many featured murder holes or arrow loops embedded in the walls beside them by the late medieval period, as firearms reduced the significance of hand-to-hand stair combat. The tactical value of spiral staircases diminished, but during the height of castle warfare in the 12th to 14th centuries, their direction remained a calculated decision. One more example of how medieval engineers used space, movement, and psychology to shape the battlefield under stone ceilings. Arrow slits, or loopholes, were among the most deceptively simple features in castle architecture. At first glance, they appeared as thin vertical openings in thick stone walls, barely wide enough to fit an arm through. But their function, and the engineering behind them, reflected a deep understanding of both defense and visibility. These narrow apertures gave defending archers the ability to strike with deadly accuracy, while remaining almost entirely shielded from return fire. Their placement, dimensions, and internal shaping varied across regions and periods, but none were arbitrary by the 12th century. As crossbows and longbows grew more powerful, the design of arrow slits became more refined. Early versions were little more than straight vertical cuts in masonry. Later, especially in concentric castles, like those commissioned by Edward I in North Wales, Harlech, Beaumaris, and Carnarvon, the interior of the slit was flared. This widening on the inner side gave archers an expanded field of fire, without compromising external defense. The external opening remained minimal, just enough for the bowstring to clear. Internally, however, the embrasure could angle outward to nearly a meter in width, allowing horizontal aim of up to 60 degrees or more. In some cases, the design allowed for more than just arrows. Crossbowmen needed slightly different accommodations. Lower slits, sometimes paired with bench-like firing positions. The Château de Loches in France contains fine examples of this, where differing slit sizes reveal a tactical layout for both long-range and close-quarters shooting. Slits were also placed at varying heights, allowing defenders to cover ground-level approaches, drawbridges, and blind spots around towers and curtain walls. Though static in appearance, some arrow slits had surprising versatility. In rare examples, swiveling shutters or sliding covers allowed defenders to temporarily close the opening. Others featured small, pivoting wooden screens or metal plates, helping conceal movement or protect archers from retaliatory projectiles. In advanced fortifications, such as the Crac des Chevaliers, held by the Knights Hospitaller in the 12th and 13th centuries. Slits were integrated into multiple tiers of defense, overlapping fields of fire to ensure no section of wall remained vulnerable. The psychological effect of arrow slits was just as deliberate as their physical function. From outside, they gave the impression of a silent, watchful fortress. Attackers faced a blank wall punctuated by slivers of shadow, any of which could suddenly release death. During sieges, the defenders inside could remain almost invisible, exploiting the structure's geometry while observing enemy movement in relative safety. Arrow slits were not merely practical, they represented a shift in military architecture. From passive defense to active resistance, every angle was calculated, every stone carved for a purpose, and every slit in the wall turned a static building into a controlled and highly dangerous battlefield. The image of a wide, water-filled moat circling a stone fortress has become iconic, a symbol of medieval defense. But across much of Europe, the reality was often less theatrical. In many cases, moats weren't deep, and many weren't even wet. Yet they remained a staple of castle design for centuries. Their true purpose extended beyond physical obstruction. They were as much psychological deterrence as they were military defenses. Early examples of dry moats, also called ditches, appear as far back as Iron Age fortifications. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, Norman and Plantagenet castles incorporated them regularly. Dug wide and deep around curtain walls or keeps, they served as the first line of disruption. Even when dry, the steep, sloped banks made it difficult for siege engines like battering rams and towers to approach the walls directly. Attackers often had to descend, cross the base under fire, then climb again, all while exposed to defenders. Above water-filled moats were more common in low-lying regions. In the Netherlands and parts of France, high water tables allowed castles, like Château de Sully-sur-Loire, to maintain functioning moats year-round. But even in these locations, the water itself rarely posed the biggest threat. It slowed down infantry, made undermining operations difficult, and limited the use of ladders or siege equipment. However, maintaining a filled moat was labor-intensive and prone to stagnation, especially in summer months. In many inland areas, castles relied on diverted rivers or dammed streams, but such systems could be sabotaged or disrupted. Bodiam Castle, in Sussex, built in 1385, is one of the most famous examples of a water-moated fortress. Yet historians continue to debate its defensive seriousness. With large, symmetrical towers reflected in the calm water, Bodiam appears formidable, but its walls were relatively thin, and many features point to a concern with appearance. The moat there may have served more to impress than repel. It conveyed wealth, authority, and impenetrability, even if actual military value was limited in drier regions. Moats evolved into elaborate dry ditches, reinforced with palisades or hidden stakes. At Crac des Chevaliers, in Syria, the Crusader stronghold used a wide dry moat carved into bedrock. This forced attackers to approach through narrow causeways, ideal kill zones for archers and crossbowmen stationed above. In such cases, the moat's value came from funneling enemy forces into predictable, vulnerable paths. Beyond tactics, moats played a symbolic role in feudal society. The moat created a literal boundary between the ruled and the ruler. It defined territory and status, separating the lord's domain from the outside world. Whether filled with water or left as dry earth, the trench marked a line that was not meant to be crossed lightly. Medieval castle walls were more than barriers. In many cases, they concealed a second layer of design, hidden chambers, narrow corridors, and passageways carved directly into the stone. These interior spaces served multiple purposes, from the purely functional to the strategically deceptive. Some were constructed as part of the original plan. Others were added during later expansions or in response to shifting threats. What they all shared was secrecy and utility. In major European castles, curtain walls could reach widths of 8 to 12 feet, especially in concentric designs like those seen at Caerphilly or Harlech in 13th century Wales. This thickness wasn't just about stopping siege engines. It created enough space for staircases, storerooms, armories, and in some cases, hidden chambers concealed behind false walls. These interior spaces allowed defenders to move unseen between towers or between different levels of the wall. When the outer courtyard was compromised, these passages offered alternative routes, and in some cases a final line of retreat. At Château de Loches in France, sections of the wall contained spiral stairs and chambers embedded within the stone. These were used for both rapid movement and protection of supplies during sieges. In the Tower of London, parts of the medieval inner wall, particularly those surrounding the White Tower, include blocked-off passages that once connected rooms and halls without exposing individuals to the open air. In fortified keeps, like Rochester or Dover, wall passages gave direct access from the kitchens or granaries to upper chambers, allowing provisioning to continue under attack. But the most intriguing use of wall chambers came during the high and late medieval periods, when castles became symbols of political power as much as military necessity. Hidden rooms were sometimes used to secure valuable documents, gold, or sacred relics. At Conwy Castle, also built by Edward I's engineers, a narrow passage runs within the wall, linking the chapel tower to the Great Hall, a design likely intended to allow discreet movement between public and private areas. Escape tunnels, also occasionally threaded through these thick walls, though genuine examples are rare. One of the most frequently cited is the tunnel system beneath Hohenzollern Castle in Germany. While later renovations have obscured much of its medieval structure, documents suggest the original fortress had concealed exits built into its curtain walls. These would have provided a final route out if all other defenses fell. Not all secret spaces were military in purpose. Some held prisoners, isolated from the main keep. Others were used by guards for nighttime surveillance. Small slits carved into the outer walls allowed watchmen to observe the grounds while remaining unseen. These hidden observation points, sometimes mistaken for primitive arrow loops, were often integrated into the very thickness of the walls themselves. These rooms were never marked, rarely recorded, and often forgotten until rediscovered centuries later during restoration work. Their existence reminds us that medieval castles were not static monuments. They were dynamic machines of power, built to conceal just as much as to defend. In many medieval castles, not every door led where it appeared to. Some ended in blank walls, others opened into cramped alcoves or stairwells that doubled back on themselves. These were not accidents of renovation or architectural error. They were intentional, built into the original plans to confuse, delay, and trap intruders. Behind the grandeur of great halls and battlements, castle design often included deliberate misdirection. False entrances were a recurring element in high-security castles, particularly from the 12th to 14th centuries, when sieges became more organized and prolonged. These architectural decoys were often built to mimic access points to vital chambers, such as the Lord's quarters or in practice, they functioned as psychological traps. An attacking force breaching the inner ward might be forced to split its ranks, wasting time and manpower chasing paths that led to nowhere. One of the clearest examples is found at Château de Cousy in northern France, constructed in the 1220s by Enguerrand III. Within its massive keep were staircases and corridors that terminated at blind ends or looped back toward the original entry point. Some of these paths appear to have no purpose until placed within the context of siege, where every minute gained could mean the difference between holding the castle or losing it. Conwy Castle in North Wales, built under Edward I in the 1280s, shows similar features. Within the inner ward, small postern doors are recessed and hidden, while others seem to offer access only to narrow, spiraling passages that lead nowhere useful. These were not meant for daily use. They were designed to disorient unfamiliar invaders and restrict access to the heart of the fortress. In the chaos of an assault, a soldier could mistake a decoy door for a direct route, only to find himself exposed and isolated. Architects often combined these false features with intentional choke points. Narrow stairwells, asymmetrical turns, and limited lighting made navigation nearly impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the layout. The effect was similar to the concept of a maze, but within stone and mortar, with lethal consequences. This defensive layering was not limited to castles of Western Europe. Islamic fortresses in the Levant, such as those controlled by the Mamluks or Crusaders, also utilized similar techniques. At the citadel of Aleppo, surviving records indicate that secondary doorways and angled corridors served both practical and deceptive purposes. The use of false architecture was not solely military. It also reflected the era's deeply embedded suspicion. In courts rife with betrayal, assassination, and political intrigue, lords often requested private escape routes and misleading features to protect themselves from threats, not only outside the walls, but within them. In some cases, servants or guards were the only ones who knew the real layout, passing knowledge orally to prevent records from falling into the wrong hands. These dead ends and false paths were not the product of superstition or paranoia. They were strategic elements rooted in the hard realities of medieval conflict. A castle was not simply a fortress. It was a machine built to confuse, mislead, and survive. Inside the stone walls of medieval castles, sound was more than background noise. It was a tool, carefully considered, shaped, and sometimes weaponized. In an age without microphones, radios, or amplifiers, effective communication relied on architecture. Builders and patrons understood that sound moved differently through stone. And in the largest spaces of a castle, the great hall's audience, chambers, and inner courtyards, acoustics could determine how power was heard or how silence was used. Great halls weren't just centers of feasting. They were political arenas and command centers. Orders were given, oaths were sworn, disputes were settled. In these moments, clarity mattered. At Durham Castle, the 14th century Norman hall was constructed with a high timber roof and angled walls, shaping the sound so that a voice at the raised dais could carry clearly to the opposite end of the chamber. This was no accident. Builders often used barrel vaults or arched ceilings to prevent echoes from muddling speech. In some halls, the arrangement of furniture and tapestries also played a role, absorbing or redirecting sound where needed. In defensive architecture, Acoustics served a different function. Some spiral staircases and narrow passageways were designed to amplify even small noises. The clank of armor, the scuff of a boot, or the murmur of movement. Defenders could hear intruders before seeing them. In confined spaces like gatehouses and kill zones, this sensitivity to sound became a layer of early warning, especially during nighttime or low visibility conditions. Whispering galleries, though rare in castles compared to cathedrals, did exist in certain towers and high-status halls. These architectural features exploited curved walls or domes to carry a whisper from one side of the room to another. At crack-day chevaliers in Syria, sections of the inner fortress used enclosed stone corridors that funneled sound clearly over distance, allowing commanders to issue instructions without raising their voices or exposing themselves to enemy view. The awareness of acoustic properties extended to religious spaces within castles. Chapels built inside strongholds, like the one at Castle Rising in Norfolk, were often designed with reverberant stone walls and vaulted ceilings that enhanced Gregorian chant and sermon clarity. This not only supported liturgical function, but reinforced a sense of control and divine authority among the garrison or visiting nobility. Even castle courtyards reflected acoustic intent. In the Alcazar of Segovia, Spain, the arrangement of towers and walls allowed voices to bounce and carry across the yard, useful for public proclamations or martial drills. In some cases, it also aided in eavesdropping, especially in politically tense courts. Sound was not always visible, but it was understood. Medieval builders, without modern tools or theories, relied on experience, observation, and oral tradition to shape it. For them, every stone that helped a voice travel further, or blocked it completely, was part of the castle's silent, strategic design. In medieval castle design, few features were as deceptively effective as the sloped wall. Known as a batter, this outward angling base appeared in fortifications from the 12th century onward. At first glance, it seemed an architectural oddity, a cosmetic flourish perhaps, or a quirk of uneven terrain. But the purpose was entirely functional. Sloped walls were calculated responses to the evolving threats of siege warfare. They didn't just deflect attacks, they turned the physics of gravity into a weapon. The principle was straightforward. A vertical wall absorbs the full impact of projectiles, rams, or collapsing stone. A sloped wall, by contrast, deflects much of that force downward and outward. When trebuchets or mangonels hurled stones at angled surfaces, the missiles often glanced off, reducing structural damage. In siege scenarios, even small changes in wall geometry could significantly increase durability. One of the clearest examples stands at the crack-day chevaliers in modern-day Syria, a Crusader fortress rebuilt and expanded by the Knights Hospitaller in the 12th and 13th centuries. Its outer curtain wall features a steep stone batter that wraps the base of the fortification, making undermining operations more difficult and siege ladders nearly useless. Attackers who reached the wall found themselves forced to stand on a sloped incline, exposed and unstable, with limited leverage to scale the height. Sloped walls also turned fallen masonry into an additional hazard. When outer defenses were struck or partially breached, debris slid down the angled base rather than accumulating at the wall's foot. This denied attackers makeshift cover and often created dangerous runoff zones of jagged stone. Defenders understood this dynamic well. In some castles, including Château de Fougères in Brittany, arrow slits and murder holes were placed directly above these slopes. As intruders scrambled to find footing, they were struck from above, and the sloped base funneled blood, oil, and debris into chaotic channels. In the late medieval period, with the growing use of gunpowder and cannon, the strategic value of angled walls only increased. Early artillery was inaccurate but devastating. Sloped stone better resisted the shockwaves and spalling caused by cannonballs. Engineers in the 15th century, particularly in Italian and Burgundian territories, began to modify existing walls with low, wide bastions and exaggerated slopes, a transition that foreshadowed early modern star fort design. Even natural slopes were exploited. Castles like Montségur in the French Pyrenees and Hohenzollern in Swabia were built on rocky outcrops, with additional artificial slopes layered below the curtain walls. These gradients acted not only as visual intimidation but as calculated defensive tools designed to control how an enemy moved, where they could dig, and how easily they could aim siege engines. The sloped wall was never ornamental. It was an engineered barrier designed to channel gravity, redirect violence, and use the terrain itself as part of the fortress's offensive and defensive arsenal. Beneath the stone floors of many medieval castles, hidden passages twist through rock and soil, extending beyond the curtain walls into the surrounding landscape. Some emerge near rivers. Others disappear into dense woodland or break the surface miles away, long forgotten by maps or memory. Often sealed or collapsed today, these tunnels were once critical lifelines, not always for escape, but just as often for covert movement, supply, and surveillance. Across Europe, these subterranean routes varied in complexity. At Hohenzollern Castle in southern Germany, a tunnel beneath the main keep connects to outer defensive positions, reportedly intended for both emergency withdrawal and reinforcement. In England, the 12th century Dover Castle features a well-documented underground network carved directly into chalk. Initially developed to house troops and supplies during the Napoleonic Wars, parts of the system overlay earlier medieval escape corridors, one of which exits on the cliff face above the English Channel. In many cases, the tunnels served multiple functions. At Caerphilly Castle in Wales, a narrow postern gate concealed in the outer wall connects to a steep, stone-lined passage leading away from the stronghold. While often referred to as an escape tunnel, its layout also allowed for the secret delivery of food, messages, or even reinforcements during prolonged sieges. These routes were often so well hidden that only a handful of trusted retainers knew of their existence. Smuggling, too, played a role. In border castles, along contested zones, such as those between English and Scottish territory, tunnels were used to bypass blockades or send riders out with intelligence. In some cases, they allowed lords to receive guests or allies in secrecy, particularly during periods of civil unrest. During the Wars of the Roses, there are recorded instances of nobles using these routes to shuttle soldiers into supposedly secure keeps, turning the concept of the escape tunnel into a Trojan horse-like inversion. But not all tunnels reached their destination. In many castles, construction began with the intention of reaching a nearby wood or ravine, only to be abandoned due to flooding, collapse, or structural limitations. Some led nowhere at all, ending abruptly in bricked-up alcoves or unfinished chambers. At Château de Chinon, in France, one such tunnel beneath the royal apartments was found to stop just short of the outer moat. Its purpose unclear, but its secrecy obvious. The existence of these tunnels often reflects the deep anxiety of the era. Lords faced not only external sieges, but internal betrayal, political assassination, and dynastic conflict. A castle's strength was not just in its walls or towers, but in its unseen exits, the paths known only to those with reason to flee or to return unseen. Hidden beneath centuries of soil, these routes still whisper the strategies of a time when control depended not just on who held the gate, but who could vanish behind it. Stone walls of medieval castles often hold more than structural strength. Etched into corners, stairwells, and thresholds are small, cryptic markings, easy to miss, but deliberate. These were not merely decorative flourishes. Many serve distinct functions: identifiers, protective signs, or encoded communications, left by the very people who built the fortress. Masons' marks were among the most common. These symbols, geometric lines, hammers, initials, stars, were carved by individual stonemasons to track their work. In the guild systems of the 12th to 15th centuries, payment often depended on the number of stones cut or laid, and marks provided proof of labor. These symbols were rarely public knowledge. Known only within the guild or lodge, they served as a professional signature. At castles like Burg Eltz in Germany and Kilkenny Castle in Ireland, such marks are still visible on interior walls, clustered around doorways and vaulted ceilings. But some markings weren't about wages, they were about protection. Apotropadic symbols, known today as witch marks, were carved into stone or wood to ward off evil. These include daisy wheels, overlapping circles, or VV initials believed to invoke the protection of the Virgin Mary. They are often found near entrances, fireplaces, or staircases, transitional spaces thought to be spiritually vulnerable. In castles such as Warkworth in Northumberland, several rooms contain these protective carvings near windows and hearths, likely added by superstitious builders or occupants during periods of religious tension or plague. More obscure are the graffiti and inscriptions tied to spiritual or esoteric meaning. In some cases, Hebrew letters, alchemical symbols, or planetary signs appear etched into stone, particularly in structures built during the Crusades or near monastic centers. Though interpretation varies, some of these may have been added by itinerant craftsmen exposed to multiple belief systems, or as quiet nods to religious heterodoxy at times of suppression. Montségur, associated with the Cathar heresy in 13th century France, includes symbols that have prompted scholarly debate, though direct links to doctrine remain unproven. In certain castles, especially those constructed or expanded during periods of political upheaval, symbols may also have been used to communicate subversive messages. While rare, some marks may have served as signals between sympathetic workers or factions. During the English Civil War, hidden etchings found in Warwick and Pontefract castles suggest ideological loyalties, though such claims remain contested and difficult to verify without corroborating records. These markings reveal that the workers who shaped Europe's most enduring fortresses were not just laborers. They were craftsmen with beliefs, loyalties, fears, and traditions. Every carved symbol preserved in cold stone is a fragment of their identity, and a reminder that history was not only shaped by kings and generals, but by the hands that raised the walls. Fire remained a constant threat in medieval castles, even those built from thick stone. Behind the masonry, timber-framed roofs, wooden floors, staircases, and hoardings created extensive fuel for flame. During sieges, attackers often targeted these vulnerabilities. Flaming arrows, pitch-soaked projectiles, and even simple torches could turn a stronghold into a death. To counter this, some builders began integrating fire-resistant materials and defensive strategies. Innovations often hidden from the casual eye. In high-risk areas, such as kitchens, smithies, and storage rooms, fireproofing became a priority. One of the earliest solutions was the use of vaulted stone ceilings. In castles like Château de Vincennes outside Paris, kitchens were constructed with ribbed stone vaults, isolating flames from spreading into upper floors. Fireplaces were recessed deep into thick stone walls, with flues directed away from structural timber. Lime plaster was also widely used. In castles across Central and Eastern Europe, interior wooden beams and thatched areas were sometimes coated in limewash, not just for sanitation, but as a rudimentary fire retardant. When applied in layers, lime helped slow the combustion of dry wood. It wasn't foolproof, but it offered precious extra minutes in a crisis. In more advanced fortifications of the 13th and 14th centuries, builders began designing stone gutters to divert flaming oil or pitch dropped by defenders during a siege. These prevented runoff from igniting the castle's own defensive galleries. In Edward I's Welsh castles, particularly Beaumaris and Harlech, such drainage systems were built into the outer walls and parapets, channeling dangerous fluids away from vulnerable walkways and towers. Some lords invested in alternative construction materials. At Carnarvon Castle, slate was used extensively in roofing rather than the more flammable wooden shingles common elsewhere. Slate not only shed water efficiently, but also resisted fire far better than traditional roofing. Similarly, in regions where volcanic stone or dense granite was accessible, these materials replaced lighter sandstone in key areas, especially gatehouses and towers. By the late medieval period, fire precautions extended to storage practices. Gunpowder magazines, increasingly common by the 15th century, were housed in separate stone vaults with heavy wooden doors soaked in water or lined with lead. In fortified manors like Bodiam Castle, barrels of sand and water were kept near kitchens and armories, a sign that the threat of internal fire was never underestimated. Despite the visual dominance of stone, fire remained a defining hazard. The unseen layers of fire prevention buried in walls, under floors, or blended into architectural decisions, reveal the evolving awareness of medieval engineers. Their goal wasn't just to defend against enemies at the gate, but against the threat already smoldering within. The drawbridge was more than a movable walkway. It was a feat of engineering precision, designed to secure entrances while maintaining accessibility. These massive timber platforms often spanned moats or ditches, pivoting upward to seal off the only approach to the gate. To an approaching force, the mechanism appeared to rise by sheer manpower. In reality, its movement was governed by hidden systems of counterweights, pulleys, and balance, innovations that made even multi-ton structures lift with surprising speed and control. In the 13th century, as castles grew larger and more complex, drawbridges evolved beyond simple lifting platforms. Engineers began incorporating pivoting systems connected to vertical drums inside the gate towers. These drums, wound with thick ropes or chains, were rotated by internal cranks or capstans, often powered by a small team of men. But what made the system appear effortless was the integration of concealed counterweights, heavy stone blocks or lead weights, suspended within the tower walls. When a drawbridge needed to be raised quickly, especially in the chaos of an approaching siege force, these weights provided momentum. In well-designed systems, a single release could engage the mechanism, and the bridge would swing upwards in seconds. This wasn't just for convenience. In sudden raids, speed was survival. At Château de Perrefons in France, the counterweight shafts and pulley tracks remain visible today. offering rare physical evidence of the system's sophistication. Attackers rarely had a chance to observe the mechanics. The working parts were enclosed behind thick walls or hidden within the upper levels of the gatehouse. By the time the bridge began to rise, those on it were already trapped in motion, forced to leap, retreat, or fall. In sieges recorded at strongholds like Chateau Galliard, chroniclers noted the effectiveness of drawbridges not just as barriers, but as sudden, kinetic defenses. Some castles employed more than one bridge. At Bodiam Castle in England, the main access point was guarded by a drawbridge and a turning bridge, an early type of rotating platform, both manipulated using internal balance systems. These were layered with portcullises and murder holes, above forming a deadly bottleneck. By the late Middle Ages, the engineering of drawbridges had become a specialized craft. Manuals from the 15th century, such as those of Villard de Honnecourt and later German military treatises, included detailed diagrams for raising platforms and counterbalance levers. Builders understood that strength alone didn't protect a fortress. Timing, motion, and mechanical design could shift the outcome of an entire assault. In the illusion of weightlessness, the drawbridge concealed a calculated blend of geometry and gravity. It wasn't just a door to the castle, it was a trap, activated with purpose, precision, and often no warning at all. Fresh water determined whether a castle could withstand weeks of siege or collapse within days, while high walls and towers drew attention. Survival often depended on what lay beneath the fortress. Medieval engineers developed increasingly sophisticated water management systems, largely invisible but absolutely vital. Without a reliable source of clean water, disease, panic, and surrender followed quickly. Castles built near rivers or natural springs had clear advantages. At Conwy Castle in Wales, completed in the late 13th century under the orders of Edward I, engineers tapped directly into a nearby spring, channeling water into the fortress through concealed conduits. A narrow postern gate, now known as the Water Gate, allowed access to the river even during siege, protected by heavy fortifications. This gate ensured supply lines could remain open longer than attackers expected. Inland or hilltop castles, without access to running water, turned to rainwater harvesting. Cisterns, stone-lined reservoirs, often located beneath courtyards or chapels, collected runoff from rooftops and paved surfaces. The Château de Jussor in Normandy contained such systems, filtering rainwater through layers of gravel and sand before storing it underground. In drier climates, like those around the Crusader fortresses in the Levant, complex channeling systems captured scarce rainfall, directing it into deep rock-cut tanks insulated from heat and contamination. Some castles integrated aqueducts. At the Alhambra in Granada, though not a military fortress in the traditional sense, Islamic engineers developed one of the most advanced medieval hydraulic networks. Water from the Darro River was redirected through underground channels, feeding fountains, baths, and defensive reservoirs. This fusion of utility and architecture allowed the garrison to maintain both hygiene and morale. In prolonged sieges, these systems faced stress. Wells inside castles were targeted by sappers and poisoned by infiltrators. At the Siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, rebels cut off their own access to water by retreating to a higher keep without internal sources. The result was near immediate exhaustion and forced surrender. In response, later castles like Harlech and Carcassonne were constructed with multiple water sources, one internal, one external, both defensible. Engineers also accounted for overflow. Drainage tunnels beneath castles prevented flooding and routed waste away from potable supplies. Some were designed with siphoning systems to remove stagnant water, reduce disease risk, and maintain usable reserves. The balance between storing enough water and preventing contamination was of constant concern. The success or failure of a siege often came down not to breached walls or fallen towers, but whether the defenders had access to one thing: clean, concealed, sustainable water. And for that, entire systems were hidden beneath the fortress floor. From the first glimpse across the horizon, medieval castles were designed not just to defend, but to dominate. Their towering silhouettes, massive gatehouses, and elevated positions sent a message long before an arrow was ever loosed. Castles were instruments of power, not just military, but psychological. Every stone was placed to assert control, project status, and enforce hierarchy. This concept took architectural form in ways that went beyond necessity. Gatehouses, for instance, were often deliberately oversized. At Caerphilly Castle in Wales, built in the late 13th century by Gilbert de Clare, the twin-towered gatehouse dwarfed visitors as they approached. Its layered defenses, portcullises, murder holes, arrow loops, were real, but their psychological effect was arguably just as significant. To walk beneath such towering structures was to feel vulnerable, watched, and subordinate. The placement of castles on elevated ground was common for tactical reasons, but it also carried symbolic weight. In feudal Europe, height equaled authority. Castles like Hohenzollern in Germany or Montségur in France sat atop ridgelines, making any approach an uphill climb, physically and socially. Lords looked down on their tenants, literally and figuratively. This spatial hierarchy reinforced social order. Inside, the architecture continued the performance of power. Great halls were typically built on the upper levels of the keep or main residence, forcing visitors to ascend staircases before reaching the seat of authority. The hall at the Tower of London, especially under Edward I, was elevated above the ground floor, accessible only by a grand external staircase. The psychological ascent mirrored a social one. Approach meant deference. An elevation equaled dominance. Windows were placed for more than light. Arrow slits facing outward ensured outsiders could not see within, while high-positioned windows in lordly chambers allowed those inside to observe without being seen. This control over vision created asymmetry. The powerful could watch, the powerless could only guess. Color and ornamentation also communicated messages. Heraldic symbols were carved into entryways, fireplaces, and parapets, often in stone that outlasted the regimes that built them. Castles under the French monarchy in the 14th century bore fleur-de-lis and other dynastic emblems, turning the walls into permanent proclamations of legitimacy. Even the soundscape played a role. Echoes in large halls and stone corridors amplified footsteps and voices, making a single man's presence feel larger. In castles such as Crac-des Chevaliers, once held by the Knights Hospitaller, the acoustics enhanced the authority of commanders addressing troops or courtiers. Castles were not neutral spaces. They were deliberately designed to impose a psychological order as much as a military one. The architecture didn't just repel invaders, it shaped behavior, reinforced status, and made clear who held control. To enter a castle was to step into a constructed world where power was etched into the walls.